The haunting is hers. He knew the house to be empty, at least that is what he thought. He would stand there in his garage, softly sponging his car and dripping streaks of suds. It had that empty quality, that much he could say. The windows looked so vacant because of the absence of curtains. The lawn was so unattended, weeds growing freely like reaching fingers. No one came to tend the garden, not anymore, from what he could see. The for sale sign had been there for almost a year, standing askew in the mesh of weeds. He remembered the former owners of the house, a nice man and his son. The man had been bald, with a bulging stomach. He was kind, he remembered. Frank was his name. He thought from inside his garage, a pool of water collecting around his sandals. Frank had kept good care of his lawn, always mowing and tending after it. His son was always gone, doing whatever teens like to do. The son would crank up the radio of his Jeep to full blast as he sped away, his father dryly waving after him. "Frank did take care of that lawn," he said distantly, scanning the length of the unkept grass by the front door with his eyes. He recalled Frank fertilizing the lawn himself and planting flowers nearest the front porch. He would water them constantly and would trim the plants that were growing too fast for his liking. He would get down on his hands and knees, plucking the dandelions with his plump fingers. He would go through his normal routine of yard work and then stop. He would either just stand there by the side of his house or sit on the porch in a glider. He would stare out into nowhere, sometimes smoking a cigarette or eating a sandwich. "That man really loved his yard," Ben muttered. He gave the empty house one last look, almost expecting to see Frank standing by the side of his yard, hands on his hips. Why didn't he go into his house after finishing all those chores? Ben thought to himself. Why did he never leave the vicinity of his lawn? Come to think of it, any time Ben saw Frank, he was always outside working on the lawn, going through the regular routine. After mowing, watering, and weed picking, he'd still stay outside. He would stare up into the sky as if he were studying a flock of birds. Ben had talked to him only once, and he had seemed normal enough, back when Ben's wife was still alive. They went over to visit Frank when he first moved in. His son was hauling a set of dresser drawers. His long blonde hair covered his face like a screen, but the boy managed to guide himself into the house. Frank was standing in the lawn, barefoot, and clutching a shovel. He noticed Ben and his wife and waved. "Frank Donahue, nice to meet you two," Frank said. That had thrown Ben off. It was like he didn't even have to introduce himself. The new neighbor had already done all the talking. "I'm Ben, and this is my wife Angela," Ben said, shaking Frank's sweaty palm. Angie did the same. "We live across the street, right over there," Angie explained, gesturing toward the correct house. "Nice neighborhood?" Frank asked, turning his attention back to the lawn. "Oh, yes," Angie replied, giving Ben a side glance. Frank then fell on his knees in the grass, both hands pressing against the earth. "Does this yard feel a little lumpy to you?" he asked, giving them both a crooked grin. "I don't—" "Never mind," Frank snapped, cutting Angie off. He got back to his feet with a loud grunt. "Who owned the house before?" Frank asked, clutching his shovel again. "A nice couple," Angie said, clearing her throat. She gave Ben another look. "They had a nice young daughter," Ben added, ignoring Angie's stare. "There was a misunderstanding," Angie interrupted, elbowing Ben. Frank seemed to wince at this. He stabbed the blade of the shovel into the lawn. He turned his bald head slowly to Angie. His brown eyes resembled two black holes. "A misunderstanding?" "Well," Angie began, "it was an accident." She glowered at Ben, running her fingertips across her brunette bangs. Ben figured Frank needed to know, or at least had a right to know. "Their daughter disappeared," Ben concluded. "Right after she went missing, the couple moved out and split up from there." "How is that a misunderstanding?" Frank asked. Angie seemed to blush there on Frank's driveway as Ben stood idly by her. "I don't believe the girl's parents were good people. I saw them together. They were terrible to each other. They shouted a lot and touched their daughter." "Touch her?" Frank said. "Like pushing her or pulling her really hard out the door of their car. Stuff like that," Ben explained. "She was only 9. I always wanted to say something." "That doesn't prove that the parents had something to do with their disappearance," Frank advised. There was a bang as the teenage boy reappeared on the porch. He now had his hair pulled back from his forehead, revealing a handsome young man, maybe around 17. "Jason, say hello to Ben and Angie," Frank called over to his son. "Hello," Jason said simply, before bending down over a hefty box by the door. He hauled it inside before slamming the door shut. "Teenagers," Frank mustered, yanking the shovel from the ground. I hear that, Ben replied awkwardly. Frank gave them another crooked grin. Nice meeting you, really. You too, and welcome to the neighborhood, Ben said. Did the last owner look after his lawn a lot? Frank asked as he turned back to his front porch. You know, the usual, I guess, Ben answered. I think I'll take care of it even better than he did, Frank murmured. You've got to watch out for those lumps. But you have to feed the place, right? Oh, the lawn? Yeah, I suppose that's true. Frank turned, wielding the shovel like a spear. Yes, Ben, it is. The sun gleamed off the blade of the shovel. There was a symbol etched into the finely polished steel. It was the outline of a serpent wound up in a tight coil. Somehow that symbol struck some sense of recollection in Angie. That shovel looks familiar. Is it ours or something? Angie asked Ben. Ben squinted in the direction of the shovel, but didn't recall it. I don't know, it's not like ours. This thing? Frank asked, still grinning. He held it out for Angie to examine more closely. Angie did, racking her brain for where she had seen the symbol before. Is it yours? Angie asked. Oh, no, Frank replied, stepping inside the house. This was leaning up against the door. Ben dropped the sponge and stepped out of his garage. Where had she seen that shovel before? A single tear ran down his cheek. Oh, God, Angie. He's coming back tonight with another. Ben sat by his window watching the cold house across the way. There were no lights in it now. It was silent and black as a dark pit. A slow drizzle refreshed the lawn and street outside, a thin stream of fresh water pouring out of the storm drain and into the side lawn. The house seemed alive to Ben. It seemed to breathe. Only when he really unfocused his eyes could he see the entire frame of the house expand outward like an inflating vacuum bag. The shingled roof looked as if it were sagging gradually before returning to its normal state. The windows above the house garage glinted with faint streaks of light, giving them the illusion of blinking eyes. The outside night was completely empty, not even a single rabbit squatted in the tall grass. It was only Ben in a living house, and the home knew it. It stared at Ben, its frame rocking and vibrating violently as if it were laughing at him. Fuck you, Ben muttered, nose inches from the frosted glass of his bedroom window. The house stopped breathing altogether and fell silent. Still the rain drizzled, and the street remained unoccupied. Then a Ford truck turned left onto Burberry Lane and advanced toward House 582. Ben instantly dropped to his knees before the window, peeking out of it with his nose placed on the sill. The truck pulled into the driveway of the house, which instantly started to breathe again. The passenger door opened and Frank stepped out. He had changed since the last time Ben saw him. He had lost a lot of weight, his potbelly non-existent. He had grown out a short, bushy beard, and now long, hippie hair covered his shoulders. He had a horseshoe bald patch, and Ben could understand why Frank had shaved his head for all those years. Frank looked around in a short circle, his eyes scanning Ben's very upstairs window. He bundled up his rain slicker and bent down to readjust a rain boot. Frank circled around his truck and reached into its bed. There he fumbled with a large weight. Ben found his opportunity and went for his front door. He patted the gun in his pocket and ensured it was still there as he slowly cracked open his door. Cold wind and rain struck him in the face, forcing him to grimace. He flipped up his hood and dodged outside. He shut his door softly behind him. Ben stuck to the sidewalk, stepping lightly, hand always in his pocket just in case. If Frank caught scent of him and turned, he wanted to be ready. Yet Ben didn't want to fire the weapon. The gun was there for an emergency, in case Frank turned to face Ben with his own firearm. His plan was to sneak up behind Frank and knock him out with the butt of his pistol. Then he would drown him in one of the growing puddles in the road or smash his face in on the pavement. Maybe Ben would even poke both thumbs through the bastard's throat and open his upper body like a bag of chips. Ben grinned at this, his bangs sticking to his forehead like black fingers, rain dripping in and out of his gaping mouth. He crossed the street, quickening his pace as Frank hauled a limp body from the truck. Frank threw the ragdoll figure over his shoulder as if it was nothing. Ben immediately recognized his teenage son, plus a few years. The blonde hair on the kid was even longer, dusting the soaked pavement. Ben saw much of the kid's clothes were soaked in blood, including parts of his scalp. Ben mounted the sidewalk, gun in hand, and let out a soft guttural shriek. The butt of his pistol connected with the bald spot on Frank's skull with a dry crack. Frank grunted, arms going up toward his head. His son slid off his shoulder, head first at Ben's feet. One of the kid's legs knocked Ben across the chest, and he stepped back with surprise. His foot slid off the curb, and he went sprawling backward into a shallow pool of standing water. Frank bent forward over his truck, clutching his bleeding scalp. He spun around to face Ben, eyes bulging like two sick globes. His mouth was pulled into a snarl, teeth gnashing comically. Realization crept over his face as he lumbered toward Ben, and his face fell like a descending curtain. The snarl morphed into a dark grin, showing off his famous crooked teeth. "Why, Benny, here you are," Frank said, his voice smokier than what Ben remembered. "How long has it been? A year?" Ben struggled to his feet, forgetting the pistol that lay by Frank's dead son. "You killed my wife. The day after we met you, she was never the same," Ben spat, stepping once again onto the driveway. "We both know that's not true, Ben," Frank said coldly, blood beginning to creep down his brow. His eyes flashed like the windows of the house, a high-pitched chuckle escaping his locked jaws. "She died long before that day we met. What was it? Cancer? Suicide? Does it even really matter? She made sure I found the shovel that day. It was part of her collection. And who was it that really disappeared that little girl? Was it her? Was it you? I doubt it was the girl's parents. The day after we met, right here in this driveway, she moved in with me, living in my basement, making all kinds of awful noises down there, rearranging and setting up her collection of shovels. Whenever I went down there to see what was going on, the basement was always empty, and I never saw any of her collection, but I could hear them in the night, scraping, clanking. You know how I knew she was dead? My son never saw her that day. When you came up to talk to me, only I saw her. It's because she had chosen me. She wanted me to make one last contribution to the house, my son, but I couldn't do it. I moved out and I thought I was done with her. But no, she came with me. So I'm here, with my son. He's not dead. I knocked him out just like you tried to do to me. I'm here to beg for his life. I'll allow her to take me, if that's what it takes." Ben shook his head furiously. No, you're a liar. Have you never really been inside that house across from yours? Do you know what a haunted house is, Ben? You must. You lived in it with her for who knows how long before she finally disappeared. And she didn't go far. She just walked across the street. I'll tell you what a haunted house is. It's living in the mind of your mad wife. That house is her, all of her sickness, all of her madness. If you don't believe me, open the door. Do what I'm too afraid to do. Ben wound up a fist and let it rocket at Frank's face. There was a crunch as Ben's fist compacted Frank's nose. Warm blood flooded over Ben's fingers, trickling down his arm. Frank screeched, holding his face with trembling hands. Ben then kneed Frank in the stomach, and the breath left Frank's body, rendering him silent. He teetered on his feet, one hand holding his nose, the other his gut. Ben kicked Frank as hard as he could in the side of his face, sending him sideways into the wet grass. Water splashed over his limp body. Ben was about to put a boot into Frank's face when he saw a glint of light off to his right. He turned to see the familiar shovel leaning up against the closed front door. The serpent greeted him on the tip of its blade. It was there for Frank to bury his son, but now it was there for Ben to bury his former neighbor. Ben snatched up the shovel, which radiated an immense heat from its remarkably dry handle. A charge of power flooded over Ben, seizing hold of him. He grinned, clutching the shovel to his chest, the very blade starting to glow with a tremendous orange light. The serpent on the blade began to uncoil and coil again like a stretching spring, a forked tongue poking in and out of its stenciled nose. Frank stirred there in the flooded lawn, muttering gibberish under his breath. Ben stood over him, holding the shovel above his head, meaning to bring it down in one final arc. Frank's eyes focused on Ben, and again he smiled. Now he was missing all his front teeth, and blood covered his face like a scarlet mask. "It never is full. You'll have to do this again," Frank explained weakly. "It's not your first time, and you'll do it again until you are the next meal. I thank you, for you will set me free." The shovel came down in a bright flash of orange light. When warmth struck Ben's face, he knew it was done. He fell on his knees before his kill, not even realizing he was still calling Angie's name through the mixture of rain, water, and tears. In every corner of her empty basement, Angie kept an upright shovel, leaning up against the wall. Her basement was particularly special because it was the easiest way into her house. There were too many cracks and crevices for the creatures to slip through, which she imagined as the imperfections in a brick. No matter how finely polished the brick was made, there was still a crevice for something to reside, to worm its way in. The spiders always found their way inside her basement easily enough, though they didn't bother her as much. It was the snakes that scared her. No, she had never discovered a snake inside the basement, but in her mind, they slid delicately down the wall in fleshy streamers, coiling in the corners with their backs to the wall and their head poised for attack. Every morning and evening she ventured down into the basement wearing the heaviest clothing imaginable, leather gloves, long underwear, white jacket, and boots up to her knees. She would meticulously tour around every corner, checking to see that her shovels were in place. Why shovels? Not even she could answer that. It seemed the perfect weapon to bash the serpent's head in, watching its paper tongue retract into a head flattened into a scaly pancake with strawberry syrup. Except one of her shovels was missing that day. Her favorite one. The one that was never stained. The moment she realized this, the door to the basement opened, and a figure stood there. A familiar voice called down the steps to her, and she knew that the snake had finally arrived. "Angie," the voice called. "Honey." She did not answer, but her fingers reached blindly for the nearest shovel. As footsteps proceeded down the steps toward her, she crouched in the corner and waited for her chance to strike. Like a snake, she thought to herself,